This is the crash course for History of Life. So the first thing we're going to talk about are fossils. Fossils are something you're probably familiar with. We talk about them, in a lot of different contexts. But fossils are the preserved remains of once living organisms. So often we think about dinosaur fossils, but anything else that was living can pretty much become fossilized if the conditions are right. So other animals, plants, and even microorganisms can become fossilized. The scientists who study fossils are called paleontologists, and they research, they excavate, they study the fossils, and they learn a lot about what kinds of plants and animals and other organisms have lived on Earth at different points in time. Fossils can help us to understand how life has changed over time, different trends, and what was living during certain time periods. Now, fossilization is something that there have to be some very special conditions in order for it to happen. And it has to start very, very soon after an organism dies. That's because tissue tends to break down pretty quickly following the death of the organism. Those decomposers that we've talked about in other crash courses, they start to get to work breaking down that tissue. Um, but some types of tissue, like bones, teeth, or like a hard shell, like the turtle shell you see there, those tend to break down a little more slowly than something like a soft tissue, like skin or muscle. So the harder tissues, like bones and teeth, are more likely to fossilize because they're not breaking down and decaying quite as quickly. So the fossilization process can happen. So there's a couple of different ways that fossils can be made. The most common one you probably are familiar with is permineralization, and that's when the organism gets trapped between layers of sediment, bits and pieces of rocks and soil and other particles. And the minerals in that sediment gradually replace the tissue. So what you get is no longer bone tissue, but it's the minerals from the surrounding rock and soil in the form, in the shape of that original bone. A cast or a mold of an organism can also be created. This is when the area, the material around the organism gets hard. The tissue then decays, but that impression is what's left, making a cast. So think of it like if you had, you know, clay and you shaped it around something that could decay. Once that soft tissue is gone, that clay, that hardened clay, has kind of the impression of what was once there. And that's how we can get fossils of footprints. Over here, you can see on the right are some dinosaur footprints that were preserved, and that's how those things were able to become fossilized. Um, Nests, roots, these are things that decay very quickly, but if they're in the right material that hardens, those impressions can be preserved. Now, as I mentioned before, you have to have just right conditions for fossils to form, which means most living organisms do not turn into fossils. The vast majority of organisms decompose, are broken down by those decomposers like fungi, bacteria, um, but a very small percentage turn into fossils. So, because fossils are rare to find, that means not all living organisms become fossils, and not all of the fossils that have been created have been found. There's plenty of fossils that are still locked away in the earth that scientists have not discovered, maybe never will discover if they are deep enough or, in a place where we can't get to them. Which means we have an incomplete history of life on Earth. We're not going to find evidence of every single species that ever existed. But we have a lot of information, and it still gives us a really good overview of what life on Earth has been like. And we can use what we know to kind of fill in some of the gaps if we don't happen to have a fossil for that particular species. The fossil you see right here is an early ancestor of something called a hagfish, which is a very, very long kind of eel-like fish. You can kind of see that impression in the middle. And this fish is very, very, very old, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years old. And so we've been able to see how this species has progressed over time. Now we're going to find fossils often in different layers of rock. Most often you're going to find them in sedimentary rock. And just as a refresher, sedimentary rock is formed as sediment. So these little bits and pieces here settle onto the ground, or if they're in water, they settle down to the bottom. And over time, as more and more bits of sediment fall onto this surface, the older ones get pushed further and further down. As they get pushed further down, there's increased pressure. Those pieces get pushed together more and more and more until they start to cement together, basically. And then that process creates that rock, all of that pressure. So as the sediment is, collecting, you may also get those organisms trapped in that sediment, and as they get pushed down further and further, and our fossils, we can, unearth those as we dig. It's important to keep in mind that at the top here in the newest rocks are where you're going to find the newer fossils at the top. Down here, you're going to find the oldest rocks and the older fossils. Kind of think of it as, say maybe you don't keep your room very clean and you go digging for something that you lost last year. If you just look on the surface of what's in your room on the floor, you're probably not going to find it. If you start digging down through the layers, you're more likely to find it because it's been there for some time. Clean your room, by the way. Since scientists find fossils in lots of different layers of rock, we can see how life has changed over time. And something we use is called the geologic time scale. And this is a calendar of Earth's history that was created using the ages of these different fossils and these different rocks. Now, you don't need to memorize all of these different time periods, but they are kind of good to know. Some of them you are already familiar with, I would guess. Just to look at this chart here, the top of the chart is going to be kind of more recent, and the bottom is further back. So the first column here, the eons, these are really big divisions of time. So the entire history of the Earth, up to 4.5 billion years ago, is divided into 4 eons. So right now we are in the Phanerozoic eon. The next breakdown are eras. So the Phanerozoic is broken into 3 eras, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. So we are in the Cenozoic era. So remember, we're up here, this top line is today. Each era is divided into periods. You can see the Paleozoic has a whole bunch. The Mesozoic is divided into 3 periods, the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic. Again, that's where I'm guessing you've probably heard of those periods. If you've seen Jurassic Park or you know anything about dinosaurs, that's when a lot of those dinosaurs you're familiar with once lived. And then up here, we are in the Quaternary period. And then these periods over here are divided into smaller periods of time called epochs. Um, and so we are in the Holocene right now. There are two main ways to find out how old fossils are. Unfortunately, they don't come with handy little tags on them that say, I belong to this kind of organism and this is how old I am. Scientists had to come up with some other ways to tell that. The two different types are relative dating and absolute dating. Dating as in figuring out how old they are. So, relative dating is a comparison method. So, you're finding out how old something is by comparing it to something else. So, for example, fossil B is younger than fossil C, but fossil B is older than fossil A. So, we're not getting an exact age or an exact year. We are just seeing how old it is compared to something else. So if we were to, all be in class together, we might all line up, based on who is older than who. So one person might stand up and say, well, I'm older than you, but I'm younger than somebody else. I don't know how old you are exactly, but I know that you were born sometime between your two other classmates. The other type is called absolute dating. That's when you can find an exact age or an exact date when that fossil was made. There are a couple of techniques that we can use to find the exact age. One that you probably will come across at some point is carbon dating or carbon 14 dating. Carbon, if you remember from one of the previous focus areas, remember carbon cycles through every living thing on Earth, lots of non-living things. You have carbon in you. There's carbon present in almost everything. Once an organism dies and the tissue breaks down, that carbon is broken out of that organism's tissues as well. And we know just from lots of studying and observing of carbon that it breaks down at a pretty predictable rate. So we know what percentage of the carbon should be present based on how long that organism has been dead. So if we measure how much carbon is in the fossil, we can get a pretty accurate age range of how old it is. So over here, this is, again, more information than you need, but it kind of gives you a visual on that process. So right after that organism died, this is showing, how much carbon is in that tissue. And then a half-life. We know how long it takes for half of that carbon to have, gone out. 2 half-lives, so that would be, well, there's only a fourth of the carbon that's left. So again, if we can measure how much carbon is left, we can get a good idea for how long that organism was once living. Now that we have a bunch of fossils, and we know obviously a lot about living organisms today, we can compare those modern living organisms to ones in the past to see how closely they're related, how they may have changed over time. And species that are more closely related share physical traits in common. And the more things you have in common, the more closely related you are. So if you look at this over here, this little graphic, we have the first thing here is vertebra, so that's a backbone. So anything that's above this red line has a vertebra. So all of these examples of these animals have a backbone. So they're somewhat related. Now if I keep going, the next trait is a bony skeleton. Well, the shark doesn't fit in that. The shark branches off before that because sharks have cartilage for their structure. The next one up is 4 limbs. Well, here's where this fish branches off. He does not have 4 limbs. And so the fish and the shark are not going to be as closely related to the birds or the crocodiles because they don't have these traits in common. If we keep going up, we can see there's a branch here where we have hair. Crocodiles and birds do not have that, but primates and rabbits and rodents do. They have hair. So they're going to be more closely related to each other than they are to, say, the sharks or the fish. So the closer they are together, the more traits they have in common, the more closely related they are. But any two species that have a common trait at all, have a shared ancestor somewhere in the past. So all of these animals, even though some may not be very closely related, all share this vertebra, which means at some point in the distant past, there was one species that all of these species eventually branched off and became. So they have a common ancestor. They have a family member in common somewhere way, way back. There's a word here that you'll need to know, homologous, and that just means we have traits between species that are similar. So if I go back, this vertebra is a homologous trait for all of these organisms. It's a shared trait, something they have in common. Another term you should know is embryo, and that's a really early stage of development for an organism. This is timing-wise different for each organism, but for humans, based on how long it takes for humans to grow and develop, up to 8 weeks of development is the embryo stage. So from the moment of conception until 8 weeks, that stage is known as an embryo for a human. And these are some pictures of the embryonic or embryo stage for some different organisms. If two species share a common ancestor, their embryos will often have similar, or remember that word, homologous, features. So again, if there are features in this embryo stage that are similar, that means that somewhere at some point there was a common ancestor. Now, sometimes embryos have traits in common at this stage that later they no longer have. That's why we look really different from a lot of these organisms that you see pictured. But they give us an idea of how things fit together, how species are related. I want you to notice we have a fish, we have a salamander, a tortoise, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. Think about those organisms as they look, once they're fully grown. They're really different. Humans look really different than fish, than chickens, than cows. But in this extraordinarily early stage, these embryos look awfully similar. There are many, 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 many similarities. Now, once they start developing, we start to see some differences. The fish and the salamander look pretty different right off the bat. The humans, the rabbits, the cows, the pigs, those all still look pretty similar. And if you think about which of these species we share more in common with, that kind of makes sense. We don't have a lot of traits in common with a fish or a salamander. We have maybe a few more in common with a tortoise and a chicken, which is why they look not terribly far off. We share a lot with pigs, cows, rabbits. We're mammals. We have 4 limbs. So there's a lot of commonalities there, even though obviously we look very different than a rabbit. Once those embryos keep developing, you start to see, a lot more differences start to pop out. As I mentioned, you're going to see features in embryos that the adults or the more developed versions of those species don't have. So we have traits as embryos that kind of disappear or become other traits or features. Something is, a good example of that is a notochord. Notochords are kind of here where this vertebra is, where this backbone is. In humans, eventually the notochord develops into the spinal cord. So that's where all of those nerves are going from your brain to the various other parts of your body. Other species have notochords that turn into other structures. So they may not turn into a spinal cord, but they might turn into something else. But we all have those notochords at this embryo stage. Again, that shows a common ancestor. Another thing are gills. You probably think of fish when you think of gills. That's how they are able to get oxygen out of the water. But you also had gills once upon a time when you were an embryo. Those gills obviously don't stick with us. We don't have gills. They develop into other features. They turn into other things. But that initial structure of gills is still there. Other organisms, here's a bird, for example, they also do not have gills when they are fully formed, but they do in the embryo stage. Here is a diagram that shows hand structures, and again, we see a lot of similarities here. They're the same general shape. They have kind of this grouping of small bones, which forms kind of where that palm area is, and then they have these longer bones extending outwards, which would be where your fingers are. These are really similar features. That's showing that a panda, a chimpanzee, a human, and a gorilla at some point had a common ancestor. Again, the more similar, the more closely related. So here you can see the gorilla, human, and chimpanzee. These hands look pretty similar. The chimpanzee's fingers are a little longer, the gorillas are a little bit wider, but the structure is pretty much the same. Now the panda, similar, but it has a couple of marked differences. You have kind of this extra, little thumb appendage here. Their hand bones, these small bones, are arranged and shaped a little bit differently. The way that these digits are arranged is a little different than how these three are, which tells us that the gorilla, the human, and the chimpanzee are more closely related to each other than they are to the panda. The one thing I want you to hopefully take away from this is the idea of a common ancestor. If you remember one thing from this, it's the more traits that you have in common, the more closely related you are, and that if you have any traits in common, that means there was a common ancestor at some point.